gentle reader. If you wonder how come these two unlikely characters, Amit Varma and Ajay Shah, are collaborating on this podcast, here is an insight. When the Bob Dylan Nobel Prize happened, at that split second, I had exactly those ideas. Proposition 1, that, yeah, that is literature. And Proposition 2, Dylan before Springsteen? It should have been the other way around. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the newest show in town. Everything is everything. Amit, have you noticed how we're such a polyglot show?
Okay, first of all, we're not quite the newest show in town because this is episode 13, lucky number. But why are we polyglot? Kindly explain.
I wanted to count all the languages, okay? English, yes? Okay, then the other day, when I tried to minimize the virtues of Chandigarh, you fought back in fluent Punjabi. Then, when I tried to minimize the virtues of Subhash Chandra Bose, you fought back in fluent Bengali. Then we did a snatch of Konkani around Katorre Bhaji. Okay, and there have occasionally been bits of Hindi. So it gives us 5 languages in one show.
Well, last week we did speak about how culture is such a delightful khichdi, so I'm really happy about that. But I have a thought for you. And I have 2 contradictory thoughts, and the second of us will help us segue nicely into the first chapter. And the first of those thoughts is something that the great philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein would have sort of approved of, which is that, look, every language is essentially hugely limited because you cannot have a word for everything that goes on, for every emotion, for everything, for whatever, Jorge Luis Borges once had this great little short story about how a map of the world would have to be as big as the world to be accurate. And it would instantly be out of date because the world keeps changing. You do not step in the same map twice. and that was sort of, that would be Wittgensteinian thinking about it, that language itself is incredibly inadequate. And in his great masterpiece, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he famously said, "What can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." And I love these words, whereof, thereof. So my first point is that any one language on its own is inadequate. Certain languages, you express things in them that no translation can capture. Like Schadenfreude, for example, a German word, though the feeling exists elsewhere, but being able to nail it down so precisely makes for a difference in expression. But my contradictory point to this is that language, in its elusive way, when it's used in storytelling, can still be something beautiful, that a song in one language can still affect anybody who can understand even the rudimentary bits of this language. And so it is appropriate that we are, going to spend this episode talking about a songwriter both of us adore who wrote songs exactly like that, the boss. So, dear viewer, or gentle reader as Ajay likes to call them, this episode releases on September 22nd, and 23rd of September is Bruce Springsteen's birthday. Ask me how I know that.
How on earth do you know that?
Okay, not because I looked it up or something. I've known it all my life because my mother's birth date is 23rd September. And just as a bonus, there'll be a video of a song where she is performing right in the show notes because, hey, why not, right? And I deeply love Springsteen. For me, we were talking about how we discovered all the music that we did. You told me about how you reached Van Morrison downstream of Springsteen because Springsteen was, your core influence and a rabbit hole into other musicians in that sense. And you'll elaborate on that, I hope, pretty soon. But in my case, Springsteen was downstream of Dylan. I discovered Dylan first, and Van Morrison actually parallel to Dylan. And when Dylan won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, I remember a lot of people were shocked, like Nobel Prize for Literature, songwriter hai, lyrics likhta hai. And I wrote this impassioned article in Times of India, again linked from the show notes, defending that and pointing out that, that it was an honor not for the man but for the prize itself, right? And the Nobel Prize citation very wisely honored him for creating new poetic expressions in the great American tradition of song, right? And that cuts to, I think, the heart of what literature is all about and how we must think of it. To me, literature, we think of literature as books. Books are just a form. To me, literature is words. Literature is words, and below that, literature is storytelling. And yes, you can have it in printed pages on books and so on and so forth. But anything that moves us by the way of words, to me, is literature. Like anyone would argue Shakespeare is literature, right? But Shakespeare wrote plays to be performed by people, to be read aloud and so on. And I just happen to think that, and I adore Dylan, big influence on me. But my favorite, and I won't say the greatest because one should not use such absolute terms. Once one reaches a certain age, you have to realize the world contains multitudes, everything is subjective. But my favorite songwriter of all time is Bruce Springsteen, and I'll talk about his songs later. And I have a massive long spiel on him divided into 4 parts and whatever, because I can't wait to talk about someone whose work I love so much. But first, the one interesting thing I learned about you when I got to know you is that there are 2 kinds of BS in your life which mean a lot. One, of course, is a business standard, a newspaper for which you've written for the last 63 years or something like that. I don't know what since when it began, you've been a columnist and done great work for them. But the other BS is Bruce Springsteen. So I want to ask you about, what is, tell me about your love for the
And
boss.
gentle reader, if you wonder how come these 2 unlikely characters, Amit Varma and Ajay Shah, are collaborating on this podcast, here is an insight. When the Bob Dylan Nobel Prize happened, at that split second, I had exactly those ideas. Proposition 1, that, that is literature. And Proposition 2, Dylan before Springsteen? It should have been the other way around. Let me just narrate my story and my experiences on this journey. I think many people in India have an exposure to some of the Western music canon. People tend to know about Pink Floyd, about Led Zepp, about U2, but Bruce Springsteen is relatively less known. So I think it's fun to tell that story, and it might trigger ideas for many people. I was in a hostel at college, and I'm very grateful to some seniors who purchased the LP, the vinyl of Born in the USA.
Which year was this? 1931?
1984.
Okay. Sorry. Carry on. I can't help that.
Yeah. Born in the USA, which is the most accessible of the Bruce Springsteen albums. It's got a pop sound, and that was my beginning with him. But at that time, I only had eyes, I only had ears for Pink Floyd, so I really wasn't able to think too much. Then, as a graduate student in America, there was a turning point where Susan and I discovered, just accidentally, a mini CD at a store. Okay, so for those of you who have experienced CDs, just like there were 33 RPM LPs and 45 RPM little records which would play one song on each side. The CD industry tried to do that with making a little CD. I forget the name. I think it's called an EP or something. And there was just a little bit of a live performance by Bruce Springsteen at a store in Los Angeles from a performance in 1988 that I did not go to. Okay, so I'm deeply embarrassed that it was right there. It was at the Coliseum. It was right next to my university. But I didn't go. And so there was a little bit of a live performance on an EP. And in those days, there was no internet. So this was your only access. And we bought that. And it turned out to have a live performance of Born to Run. And at the time, I was kind of exposed to the album version of the song Born to Run from the 1976 album. But it was not to my musical taste at the time. I came back to it later. Whereas here was a stripped down acoustic version of Born to Run where it is only Mr. Springsteen playing the mouth organ and a guitar and singing all by himself with nobody else on the scene. And it's an absolutely remarkable acoustic version. And for me, it was an eye-opener that, wow, I didn't know this. I hadn't understood the song in that fashion. And that one thing led to another. And then Susan and I went and bought at the time, there was a 3 CD set that was released, which was Bruce Springsteen live performances, 1976 to 1985. Okay, and that was another great entry into his life. And that's where we discovered Reason to Believe and Racing in the Street and a live version of Thunder Road and so on. There was a whole bunch of material, a live version of Independence Day. There was a whole bunch of material. And so I started increasingly understanding that there was something very big going on there. But there was a minor problem because at the time, actually, I only had ears for Led Zeppelin. So this was a sideshow. So I was primarily in a Led Zepp mode, and on the side, this was creeping on me. And then the years went by, and I moved back to India, and for some years, nothing happened. And then when I was in Delhi at the Ministry of Finance, something started going off in my head, and then I started going back to the albums. So I went back to Born to Run and Darkness at the Edge of Town and The River, and I started understanding all that material that had been done so many years ago, and it just all started coming to life for me one by one. I want to tell some little stories and pieces that are so interesting. Springsteen thought a lot about the design of an LP. So in that LP world, there was a vinyl record. There's a first song and a last song of one side. Then you have the physicality that you have to get up and change the side and then play the next side. And then again, there's the first song and the last song of the side. And he thought a lot about how to put these things together. He was a prodigal in terms of output. So around the time of making each album, he would compose and record about 20 songs. And then he would think a lot about how to put these together. About 8-10 would make it into the album, and many would get thrown away. And many of those thrown away are actually amazing material that, we could spend the rest of our lives today exploring. And in Born to Run, there was a beginning, which is the song Born to Run. And there was the last one of the side, which is Thunder Road. Okay. And then on the next side, there's Jungle Land. So each of these albums has a very distinctive, carefully designed structure. And bit by bit, these things started unfolding on me. There's a story surrounding the album Born to Run and its successor. Bruce Springsteen was in between changing from one producer to the next. I learned in that period that a record producer is actually like a co-author. So in my research world, if somebody did the things for me that a producer does for the band, they would get authorship. So that's how I think about it, that a producer is actually a co-author. So if you think of like George Martin for the Beatles or Brian Eno for U2, these are, first class participants in the creative journey, and they make a big difference to the product. So Bruce Springsteen had a first producer called Mike Appel, and Mike Appel was a part of making a song that is called The Promise. And then there was a great legal dispute between Appel and Springsteen, and Appel claimed ownership over The Promise. And Bruce Springsteen got incredibly disturbed by that legal conflict. And as a consequence, some 20-25 years went by and The Promise never got released. But actually, it's a triad and they stand together. Born to Run and Thunder Road and The Promise. These stand together. They're really three windows into the same people, into the same life. And it's great today that we are able to assemble these. In the case of all his work, there are many musical versions. So he never only stopped at one. I already mentioned Born to Run. There is Phil Spector Wall of Sound version in the album, and then there is a stripped down acoustic version. And different people, different times will get a certain version, and that's okay. I just think he's having fun knowing to do so many things. So I personally like the version of The Promise, which is in one album called 18 Tracks, which was released much later.
Can I butt in with a little story and then we'll kind of continue? Because you mentioned John Landau. Yeah. And so I have a question for you. On May 9th, 1974, what historic event took place?
No, I don't know.
Bonnie Raitt performed. You might now ask, so what?
So what?
So Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band opened for them, and a young music critic called John Landau went to watch that show. And then he wrote this absolutely legendary review of the show, and I want to read out a few lines from it, where he said, "Tonight, There is someone I can write off the way I used to write, without reservations of any kind. On a night when I needed to feel young, he made me feel like I was hearing music for the very first time. When his 2 hour set ended, I could only think, can anyone really be this good? Can anyone say this much to me? Can rock and roll speak with this kind of power and glory? And then I felt the sores on my thighs where I had been pounding my hands in time for the entire concert and knew that the answer was yes. Springsteen does it all. He is a rock and roll punk, a Latin street poet, a ballet dancer, an actor, a joker, a bar band leader, rhythm guitar player, extraordinary singer, and a truly great rock and roll composer. He leads a band like he has been doing it forever. I rack my brains, but simply can't think of a white artist who does so many things so superbly. Stop quote. And then he said the famous words. I saw my rock and roll past flash before my eyes. I saw something else. I saw rock and roll's future, and his name is Bruce Springsteen. And then shortly after that, John Landau meets Bruce Springsteen. And John Landau is 27 and Bruce Springsteen is 25. And Springsteen says that all my life I was looking for a father figure because, as I'll talk about later, he never really had a father in that sense. And this man, 2 years older than him, he saw him as dad. And he says something beautiful about Landau and, which made me think about who else is like that. And he said about Landau, John Landau was the first person I met who had a language for discussing these ideas in the life of the mind. He had the rabid fans' pure love of music and musicians while retaining his critic's ability to step back and analyze the very thing he loved. In John, the one impulse did not dampen the other. He was a natural, and together we shared a belief in the bedrock values of musicianship, skill, the joy of hard work, and the methodical application of one's talents. These things had resulted in some of our favorite records. Stop quote. And this is again so remarkable to have both the passion of the fan and at the same time that ability to step back and note the craft and be able to think kind of in a different way. I mean, Landau's original words of about Springsteen reminded me of a good friend of mine, so I'll give a shout out, Rohit Mehrotra. This is what he would write about Ali Sethi. These kind of terms. But I'm just wondering that's such a rare combination that he also found in Landau. So I just kind of wanted to say this because I'm just so struck by this happenstance sort of connection where John Landau goes to watch Bonnie Raitt performs and the world changes.
Yeah. So some things, it's just so lucky when those pieces come together. While you were speaking, I was reminded of G.H. Hardy and Ramanujan. That same sense of fascination and caution that you don't want to disrupt the Ramanujan. And at the same time, he had to be put into a modern track of mathematics. So it feels a bit like that. And I was fascinated by all these pieces as they were unfolding for me. A moment ago, I talked about many versions. Here is a thing I have started doing, which is once in a while, I'll take one song, I'll methodically assemble every single live performance in chronological order, and I hear them in chronological order. And that's interesting because, no man can sing the same song twice. And as we evolve, as we grow up, as we change, then the same song is done in a different way. And I feel the strongest place you see that is in Jungle Land. Jungle Land 1976 is brilliant, and it is different from Jungle Land in 2012, where he has grown up. He's telling us a different story. He's a different person, and I find it so fascinating to look at both. I mentioned a moment ago the prodigality of the output. Another feature is that Bruce Springsteen has been doing this stuff for a very long time. So when you think of the bands like Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or the Beatles, by and large, it's about 10 years of work. So the people manage to stay together as a creative team for about 10 years, and then it gets disrupted, or it got disrupted. Whereas with this one person, I place the dates for some of his first amazing stuff as 1972, and some of the last stuff as 2005 or 2010, depending on your views. And it's 32, 35 years of work. So there is a very large body of work. And for each published album of about 10 songs, there are around 10, 15 songs that are not published. So in a way, there is more material here than I could ever discover. So I feel like I know everything that Led Zepp did. I feel I know everything that Pink Floyd did. I feel that I've just scratched the surface of an ocean of what Bruce Springsteen has done. And on top of that, there are so many different versions. So this has just kept unfolding on me, and gradually, one by one, some of these things have just switched on in my mind. We were talking the other day, the song Jungle Land has been with me in a way for a very long time. And when we were together in Udaipur at the EV conference, something happened to me, and some lines from the song just got foregrounded, that my brain bubbled up those lines. And they are memorable lines. It's at the end of the song where he says, and man, the poets around here don't write nothing at all. They just stand by and let it all be. Somehow those lines came to my mind when we were in Udaipur. And every time I was away from the EV session, I was in my room basically just playing that one song over and over, going into different versions of it and so on. Then I find it interesting how there are songs that are simple and then there is an escalating complexity. So let me describe what I think. So there are simple, pure, well-structured songs, okay, like something out of a Gita Dutt or Yesterday by the Beatles or Both Sides Now by Joni Mitchell, where there is a meter to it, there is a clear grammar to the song, there's an architecture to the song, and it goes through and it's great. Okay, that's like a level one. Then you get to a lot of the early Springsteen stuff, which is not that. So Born to Run, Thunder Road, at first, they don't particularly rhyme. I mean, they rhyme memorably well in snatches and then it's gone. So it's a bit like modern art, that there is a lot happening without it being clearly stated. And I always found it a very intriguing and a difficult technique. That's a sense, for example, that Born in the USA 1984 is a much more accessible album. It's got simple set piece battles where there is a clear grammar to the song. Whereas a lot of the older material is just so innovative. He's doing different things and he's trying different things. And then away from these simple songs, you get to some of the things that have been done in the last 60 years, which are these really long songs. I think long songs are a genre by themselves. Okay, so you take something like Stairway to Heaven, okay, the iconic Led Zeppelin song, or November Rain by Guns N' Roses. These are like very long songs. And
or something one of Springsteen's heroes and one of my heroes, Van Morrison, did, TB Sheets. I was telling you about that a while back.
I haven't yet heard that. So what you see in those songs is that you can't do what works for a 3-minute song. You have to vary it around, and the style has to change several times to sustain a long song. And so, for example, Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven starts at an alap and then it builds from there. What is different and surprising to me is that Jungle Land does this in reverse. It starts at a wall of sound, and then there is that guitar solo, and then it switches into that amazing saxophone piece, what Bruce Springsteen calls the world's greatest saxophone solo. And then it stops. There is that little jazz sound of the saxophone and the piano. And then it turns around and he does the alap at the end. And it is so amazing. And I've wondered about this. I've thought about it. Could you have done it differently? And I think no, that they've nailed it. They've done it exactly right. That the material that has been placed at the tail, it requires that soft, wistful, helpless, quiet sound, and it wouldn't have worked to do it differently. And it's a wonder that they got it and that they put this together. Finally, I just want to talk about 2005. There is a song, Devils and Dust, which was written in the context of the American invasion of Iraq. And I remember Bruce Springsteen saying that he'd spent a whole lifetime in this craft and he knew how to write a song. That there is a song that just writes itself. It is inexorable. It is Dancing in the Dark. It is My Hometown. Those are the songs that just work on their own energy, Downbound Train. And he says Devils and Dust was like that once you got the idea, it was just a whole life of the craft, and the song wrote itself in a very short time, and it's one of those sweet and perfect songs. And I remember being shocked that at 2005, he was not young anymore. and the song just absolutely works. So I feel like this has been a part of my life in so many ways. I have noticed the writing, I've noticed the craft. For me, in the journey away from precise technical writing to beauty in written English, Bruce Springsteen has been an enormous influence in understanding beauty and in understanding how to write and in showing me sentences that just light up, and I'm just wondering like, wow, how did you do that? And I've spent hours and hours wondering that why does that work and how does that work? And so he's been a great influence for me on thinking about writing also. There's a song by Roger Waters where he talks about being able to, he says that I see myself in every stranger's eyes. And for me, that journey of growing up, right? When we are young, we are all self-centered. We only see ourselves. I think looking at the lives of others and being able to see ourselves in them, that's a journey that all of us go through. And that's what great literature does. And I think for me, Bruce Springsteen was a vital part of that. His stories, his songs are stories. His songs are, he takes you into the lives of people. There are just little people, ordinary people. There is beauty and magic in the lives of everybody. And he helped me to open my eyes and see that.
And it's so beautiful that, that an artist takes one particular journey, but all his listeners, will take different journeys of their own, and their work carries a different meaning from the, I mean, truly, when the art has left the artist, it is no longer of the artist. It's just a separate thing that's out there in the world.
Amit, tell me your story. What have you understood? What have you thought? What has Bruce Springsteen meant to you?
So, I don't kind of have a coherent narrative the way you do. I've listened to a lot of music. Springsteen was a part of my growing up, a part of my emotional landscape as well, though I would not be able to take a particular song and say this meant that to me. But I've thought a lot about his work and his craft in recent years, which is why I've just come to admire him so much as a great writer and just my favorite songwriter of all time by a long margin. So I want to talk about four broad aspects of Bruce Springsteen. One, the effort that he made, the songs that he wrote, the language that he used, and the change that he embraced. And to talk about the effort, like what do I mean by effort and intentionality and all these things that I'm getting at, I want to sort of recommend, and this could easily be my big recommendation of the episode, his great autobiography called Born to Run, because what else could it be called? And in his autobiography, he writes of a time where he was 7 years old. And he really wanted a guitar because he heard something somewhere or he saw a photograph, he was struck by it. And his mom couldn't afford to buy him a guitar. So she went to a place and they rented a guitar for him. And for a few days, the boy tried to play the rented guitar, just simply could not figure it out. And the day came for him to give that rented guitar back, right? And at that point, Springsteen writes, he takes the guitar out to the yard and all the kids are gathered around him and he writes, "The sunny morning I had to return the guitar, I stood in front of 6 or so of the neighborhood guys and gals in my backyard. I gave my first and last show for quite a while. I held the guitar, I shook it, I shouted at it, I banged on it, I sang voodoo nonsense. I did everything but play it, all to their laughter and great amusement. I sucked. It was a joyful and silly-ass pantomime. That afternoon, sad but a little relieved, I dropped the guitar off back at DL's Music. It was over for now. But for a moment, just a moment, in front of those kids in my backyard, I smelled blood." Stop quote. Right? And then there's a story where later on he manages to actually get a guitar, but he hasn't learned to tune it yet. So with the strings in whatever state of untuning they are in, he, writes a few tunes and he's playing in front of the mirror and he thinks he's really cool. And then he goes to someone and that person teaches him how to tune a guitar and tunes it for him. And then he realizes that everything he did before that was rubbish. And this is such a great metaphor for how step by step we learn so much about the craft. And then just to take a brief step away from this theme of effort and intentionality, I also wanted to talk about this moment of magic in his life, which he describes in Born to Run. And he writes, "I went back on a daily basis. This is to a record store where he used to look for records when, those little vinyl things would be there. And I think there were vinyl singles or something. There was no store in his town big enough to actually be a record store. But there was some other store which kept a bunch of those small vinyl records. So he speaks about how he once discovered it. He would go back every day and then, I went back on a daily basis until I saw it, the album cover, the greatest album cover of all time, tied with Highway 61 Revisited. All it said was Meet the Beatles. That was exactly what I wanted to do. Those four half-shadowed faces, rock and roll's Mount Rushmore, and the hair, what did it mean? It was a surprise, a shock, right? And you've just seen the cover on the screen, and it is an iconic cover, but I can see it from a distance and I can say, ha, nice looking cover, acha photo liya, if you know a little bit of the history. But to read his words and imagine that shock of recognition on a boy's face, where there is something that is both completely new and yet something that kind of speaks to him. And from that point on, all he wants to do is music. He picks up that record, listens to the Beatles, discovers Van Morrison later, discovers Dylan later. He's out playing. He has a band called the Castiles. He has a band called the Steel Mill. And in the early 70s, there is a story where the Steel Mill go to San Francisco and they go to an audition in some place. And the first couple of bands kind of are mediocre. So, the Steel Mill goes out there, they rock the show, they think they've done it. And then Springsteen sees a band come on after him that is just way better in musicianship and all of that. And they just knock the socks off and Steel Mill don't get the gig. And later on, Springsteen writes about that. I came up against some real talent and held my own, but the band that took us out at the Family Dog stayed with me. They had something we didn't, a certain level of sophisticated musicality. They were better than us and that didn't sit well with me. It's not that I didn't expect to come up against superior talent. That happens. It's the way God planned it. I was fast, but like the old gunslingers knew, there's always someone faster. And if you can do it better than me, you earn my respect and admiration and you inspire me to work harder. I wasn't afraid of that. I was concerned with not maximizing my own abilities, not having a broad or intelligent enough vision of what I was capable of. I was all I had. I had only one talent. I was not a natural genius. I would have to use every ounce of what was in me. Every ounce of what was in me. I love this phrase. Every ounce of what was in me. My cunning, my musical skills, my showmanship, my intellect, my heart, my willingness, right night after night, to push myself harder, to work with more intensity than the next guy just to survive untended in the world I lived in. As I sat there in the black, I knew when we got back home, there would have to be some changes made. Stop quote, right? And then you see him going back, and then you gradually see the shift from Steel Mill to the Bruce Springsteen band to Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, and that happens over a period of time, and we can talk at length about that. But what strikes me is that this guy, the 17-year-old kid didn't know what he was doing, but he knew he had the desire and the passion and was willing to work at it. This guy in this band called Steel Mill, which has such a local following, they go out to tour, California, and he comes up against better talent, better musical talent. And he realizes that, hey, they're better at that than us. But he knows that he wants to keep going. He wants to keep working. And you see that element of work throughout. Like, we talk of rock and roll stars. We see they made it at 23. We don't realize they might have been at it since they were 7 or whatever. The Beatles spent years and years. They did hundreds and thousands of shows in Hamburg before they, got their first album out and managed to reach a certain level. It takes so much work. You see Mozart doing great symphonies at 17 or whatever. He was composing since 5, for God's sake, right? And you see that effort in Springsteen's career and how it's not all natural bursts of genius. Ki dimag mein aa gaya, line likh dala. It's not like that. There's so much work. Like, there's a story from the first album. They signed for Columbia Records. Mike Apple was still their producer and indeed their manager. And in fact, he got them that first gig. Incredibly passionate man. He took Dylan to John Hammond. And there's this famous story. He took Dylan to John Hammond at Columbia and walked Springsteen in the door. Took Dylan there? Took Springsteen there. And he walked Springsteen in the door, and John Hammond is there, and Mike Apple is there, and Springsteen is there, and he didn't bring his kit. So he bought a second-hand guitar, and he's carrying it over his shoulder, right? This is a young Springsteen. And Mike Apple then says to John Hammond that, hey, listen, man, you discovered Dylan? Show us it was not a fluke. Right? Listen to this guy. And Springsteen in his head is cringing. He's like, what are you doing? Shut the fuck up. Right? But Springsteen performs and he kind of gets a deal, and his first 2 albums come out.
3-record deal.
3-record deal. And the first album is Greetings from Asbury Park. Right? And he writes about that in his book. After they turned it into Columbia, we turned it in and Clive Davis handed it back, saying there were no hits, nothing that could be played on the radio. I went to the beach and wrote Spirit in the Night. Came home and busted out my rhyming dictionary and wrote Blinded by the Light. Two of the best things on the record. I was able to find Clarence, the great Clarence Clemens. I was able to find Clarence, who'd been missing in action since that first night in The Prince, and I got his cool saxophone on these last two cuts. It made a big difference. This was a most fully realized version of the sound I had in my head that I would get on my first album. Stop quote. So again, he's been told there's no hits. Now typically many artist types would say कि यार ये suit बता रहा है कि commercial नहीं है. नहीं, I want to be true to my art. Springsteen doesn't do that. He says, fuck it, you want a hit, I'll write you a hit. And he goes out there and he writes the best songs on the album. Happens again. It happens again in 1984 with that album through which you discovered him, Born in the USA, where Jean Landau tells him that after the whole album is done, whole album minus Dancing in the Dark, that boss, we need a hit. And then he goes back to the room and he's like, what the fuck yaar, मैंने मतलब कि इतने गाने लिखे and I've done all of this. Of course he didn't say it in Hindi because he wasn't a polyglot, but he's like, I've done so much work, you're saying you need a hit, what shit is this? And he sits down and he writes Dancing in the Dark, a masterpiece. And again, like something I'll come to later, and you've already mentioned, it's a song with levels. It's a song with, lyrics that are actually pretty depressive, but set to an upbeat tune, as much of an anachronism in a sense as the title song was. Born in the USA was a protest song. Yeah. Some people treated it as a Born in the USA MAGA song, right? And I'll read out these lovely words from Dancing in the Dark, because you can imagine Springsteen in his hotel room, 10 minutes he's pissed off at John Landau, then he says, fuck it, what do I feel like right now? I'll turn it into song. Right? And he writes this, and I'm just reading the lyrics out because, who would dare to sing? I get up in the evening and I ain't got nothing to say. I come home in the morning, I go to bed feeling the same way. I ain't nothing but tired. Man, I'm just tired and bored with myself. Hey there, baby, I could use just a little help. You can't start a fire. You can't start a fire without a spark. This gun's for hire, even if it's just dancing in the dark.
Similarly, you can't start a fire, worry about your little world falling apart. This gun's for hire, even if it's just dancing in the dark.
It's like, fuck, what words, right? They really resonate. And I'll talk about the language he used and his songwriting later. But there's another period where after Born to Run has happened, right? And he's thinking about, who am I? And Born to Run is a change in direction. Everything is stripped down. Jean Landau, teaches him to strip down his lyrics. Though he strips it down much later on. Like I really think from his next album onwards is when he reaches his lyrical greatness and never loses it after that. And Landau helps him strip down the music. And what's happening there is that he is now beginning to think of what kind of artist I am. He's moved a little bit away from the soul R&B of his first two albums to, a more rock kind of sound. And he writes in his book about this period, each record was a statement of purpose. I wanted playfulness, good times, but also an underlying philosophical seriousness, a code of living, fusing it all together and making it more than just a collection of my 10 latest songs, though that worked out pretty well for the Beatles. I wouldn't suggest this approach for everyone. Needless to say, it has its pretensions, but I was still defining myself, and it was inspired by artists who created self-aware, self-contained worlds in their albums, and then invited their fans to discover them. Van Morrison, Bob Dylan, The Band, Marvin Gaye, Hank Williams, Frank Sinatra, all made records that had collective power. I wanted a record thematically coherent enough to hold together as a body of work, while not so single-minded as to be damned by the term concept album. I wanted something that could only come from my voice, that was informed by the internal and external geography of my own experience. Stop quote. And a lot of this is in process. Like when he wrote the song Born to Run, there's a beautiful passage in his book. I won't read it out, it's too long, but everyone should buy that book and read it to understand artistic process, where he wants to pour all of himself into that song, all of his times, all of his experiences. So he thinks, what theme should I write about? What metaphor should I use? What experiences should I pack in there? And so much work goes in. And you get a sense of this where later on, when he's producing The River, at one point he writes about his process, and he writes, and Bob Clearmountain was one of the producers who worked a lot with him, including on The River, and he writes, quote, Bob Clearmountain had mixed Hungry Heart, our soon-to-be top 5 smash, in 30 seconds, but we could never have worked with Bob. He was too fucking fast. We needed to ruminate, contemplate, intellectualize, and mentally masturbate ourselves into a paralytic frenzy. We had to punish ourselves until we'd done it our way. And in those days on East Street, our way was only one way, the hard way. I later realized we weren't making a record. We were on an odyssey, tolling in the vineyards of pop, searching for complicated answers to mystifying questions. Pop may not have been the best place for me to look for those answers, or it may have been perfect. And I'll just say that last line out. Pop may not have been the best place for me to look for those answers, but it may have been perfect. Mind blowing, Max Weinberg, his great drummer of the E Street Band, once said that I've never seen anyone work as hard as Bruce Springsteen, right? And it's not that everything was labored. Everything wasn't labored. Dancing in the Dark was written like that. He's pissed off at his manager. He's writing it. He wrote Hungry Heart in 10 minutes. Right? He said Bob Clearmountain mixed it in 30 seconds. He wrote it in 10 minutes. Where he was doodling around somewhere in a room and suddenly something struck him and he told his boys, hey boys, come play with me. I got a song. And they go and they play and it's done. And that is a record. Right? And I'll just read out some words from there as well. And he says, and everybody's kind of heard this. So music will come into your head as I read these out. Got a wife and kids in Baltimore, Jack. I went out for a ride and I never went back. Like a river that don't know where it's flowing. I took a wrong turn and I just kept going. Everybody's got a hungry heart. Everybody's got a hungry heart. Lay down your money and you play your part. Everybody's got a hungry heart. Right? And so simple. And I'll talk about the simplicity a little later, but one of the things that I keep telling my writing students, that I keep reminding myself, is that such great simplicity comes after years and years of putting in the work. One way of looking at it is that he wrote this song in 10 minutes. Another way of thinking about it is that it took 30 years to write this song. And, there's a lot of work that kind of went in, like when they were recording Born to Run. At one point, he speaks about this 3-day stint, 72 hours, where they had 3 side-by-side studios at the same time, right? Ek mein Jungle Land ka vocals chal raha hai, ek mein another song is being mixed, different songs being worked on, things being taken apart, put back together, painstaking. So that's the end of this particular chapter, where I just want to point out to everyone who wants to be an artist or creator of any sorts, that boss, it takes work, it takes intentionality. When you start, you're a 17-year-old kid with a guitar you can't play in front of your neighborhood boys, but this is a journey.
You're at episode 13 of Everything is Everything. When you start, you're at episode 13 of Everything is Everything.
Yeah, who knows where we'll be. Are you comparing us to Springsteen? Don't you dare do that.
At age 17.
No.
I want to tell 2 stories here. One is that the great physicist S. Chandrasekhar has a beautiful book called Truth and Beauty. And it's a lovely slim book. I recommend everybody should read this book. In that he talks a lot about the craft and the journey of learning how to do it. And he notices how at the end of his life, before writing the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven is writing to a friend. He says, now I know how to write music. So at the end of this entire life of writing everything else, he's saying, I feel ready. Now I know how to write music. And he writes, one of the greatest achievements of mankind, the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. And I felt something similar when I heard Devils and Dust for the first time. I just felt that journey, that this guy has been at it all his life, and this thing, it is so perfect. Everything about one life has come together in the perfection of Devils and Dust. And oddly enough, there is an interview in which Bruce Springsteen says more or less the same thing. He says, I've been at this all my life and this is my craft. I know how to do this. Another little story I want to tell is again about the prodigality. I think the hallmark of being a creator is that level of obsession and the creativity that you have to be at it all the time, and many ideas will come along. It should happen that you are prolifically producing. You should be building a lot of stuff. It shouldn't be that you make one Taj Mahal. You have to make 100 because the others will fall by the wayside. It's like making should be the passion. It should come out of your heart. You need to do it a lot. To use jargon from chess or poker, it's volume. You've got to do a lot of volume, because only then out of that the iterative refinement comes, that you get better and better. So volume counts and you have to produce a lot. So one little story. One fine day, Bruce Springsteen wrote a song. Okay, it's called Fire. Okay, you may have heard it. Driving in my car, turn on the radio. I'm holding you close, you just say no. Okay, it's a beautiful little, slightly humorous song. And he had this vision that the right person to sing this song is Elvis Presley. Okay, so listen to the lilt of the song, that it's really a Elvis Presley song. And so he got hold of Elvis Presley's phone number and he called him. Okay, Elvis Presley didn't pick up the phone. It went into an answering machine. Okay, oh ye young reader, please go Google what is an answering machine. And so Bruce Springsteen sang the song into an answering machine and dictated the lyrics there. And Elvis Presley ignored him and it never went anywhere. He tried to say to Elvis, I wrote this song for you. It'll be so great for you to do this song. And Elvis ignored him. Then he gifted this song away to the Pointer Sisters, who turned it into a #1 hit. And, many years later, Bruce Springsteen produced it himself in some live versions, and his version is the best. And I just want to say that was very influential for me personally. I learned one thing, which is just gift your stuff away. Like, don't try to hold everything. Don't try to hang on to everything. If our life is to mean anything, there will be plenty of knowledge, there'll be plenty of ideas, and the body that we own is the creature through which those ideas go out into the world. So let the ideas matter and let the ideas go out, and it isn't about this body. So all my life I have got many research ideas and I freely gift them away. I give them to other people. I don't worry, like, am I getting that paper? So it's better to keep on inventing and giving things away rather than trying to protect oneself that, oh, this is my idea. I'll write it in a notebook. One day I'll get around to it.
There's a band I love, an alternative rock band from the 80s called The Replacements, led by Paul Westerberg. And they had this great song called Answering Machine, where they had this line, how do you say goodnight to an answering machine? Right, and that expresses so much, right? Yeah. But of course, kids of today may not know what an answering machine is.
So Amit, tell us about the songs.
So now we get to the songs, and my next two sections are about that. We already spoke about the effort he made. Now I want to talk about the songs he wrote and the language he used. And then later we'll talk about the change he embraced, which is also about the songs. And the thing about Springsteen's songs is that for his music, he is taking the stuff of everyday life, the life that he's living in a small town and the life that is around him. And in a sense, you might think that, oh, it's homogeneous. He's born somewhere in a town in middle America. It is what it is. It is one thing. It is not one thing. In everything, there are multitudes. And he is there also in the midst of change happening all around him. Like, he has these great lines from Born to Run where he says, I had friends who were real drug experimenting radicals, and then I had my construction worker brother-in-law who, with the exception of bashing a few long hairs like myself, had no 60s experience whatsoever. He remained his whole life a man of the 50s. I was a faux hippie. Free love was all right. But the counterculture stood by definition in opposition to the conservative blue-collar experience I'd had. I felt caught between two camps and I didn't really fit in either, or maybe I just fit in both. Stop quote. And his life, in a sense, is a melding of the both. It is being surrounded by an old world, and it is, again, immersing himself, partly by an act of will and intention, into a sort of a new world. And the beautiful thing about him is that he is not looking at stories from myth or grand narratives or grand tales and etc., to kind of craft his work. Eventually, he is turning to the people around him, to his sister, to his mother, to his father, to all his small town friends. For example, he writes about his sister in the book. My sister Virginia became pregnant at 17 and no one realized it until she was 6 months along. In her senior year, she dropped out of high school, was tutored at home, and married her boyfriend and the father of her child, Mickey Shave. Mickey was an arrogant, leather-jacketed, bull-riding fighter greaser from Lakewood and eventually all-round great guy. Virginia, who had never boiled water, washed a dish, or swept a floor, became the toughest. She had soul, intelligence, humor, and beauty. In months, her life changed. She became a hardcore Irish working woman. Mickey worked in construction, right? Which song did this inspire?
I got a job working in construction.
Yeah, exactly. So me and Mary, we met in high school when she was just 17. And later on in the same song, I got a job working construction for the Johnstown Company, right? This is a river. His great song. He's got these. I'll just read out this entire first section because it's brilliant. Me and Mary, we met in high school when she was just 17 and then later. Then I got Mary pregnant and man, that was all she wrote. And for my 19th birthday, I got a union card and a wedding coat. We went down to the courthouse and the judge put it all to rest. No wedding day smiles, no walk down the aisle, no flowers, no wedding dress. And you can almost, if you heard the song, you can hear the next stanza because it just takes over and it has a momentum of its own. And not just his sister, his father, And that's a very fraught relationship. His father at one point thought, gave into paranoia. He thought the world is plotting against him. He thought that the love songs on the radio were a government ploy so that people would get married and pay more taxes. I'm presuming there are greater taxes involved there. And again, there's a beautiful passage where he writes about his father at one point. One evening, my father was giving me a few boxing lessons in the living room. I was flattered, excited by his attention and eager to learn. Things were going well. And then he threw a few open palm punches to my face that landed just a little too hard. It stung. I wasn't hurt, but a line had been crossed. I knew something was being communicated. We had slipped into the dark netherland beyond father and son. I sensed what was being said. I was an intruder, a stranger, a competitor in our home, and a fearful disappointment. My heart broke and I crumpled. He walked away in disgust. Stop quote. And he writes a lot about his father in his book, including about the later years, when they are kind of not at loggerheads all the time. And this is there in his song also, like one of his most beautiful songs, Independence Day. And I'll just sort of read these lines out. Well, Papa, go to bed now. It's getting late. Nothing we can say can change anything now, because there's just different people coming down here and now they see things in different ways. And soon everything we've known will just be swept away. So say goodbye. It's Independence Day. Papa, now I know the things you wanted that you could not say. But won't you just say goodbye? It's Independence Day. I swear I never meant to take those things away. Right, and now what I want to read out for you is a description, again from his autobiography, Born to Run, about the town he grew up in. And as I go through this description, you will get flashes from all his songs. Taxi driver, assembly line worker, auto worker, jail guard, bus driver, truck driver. These are just a few of the many jobs my pop worked to hold during his life. My sisters and I grew up in blue-collar neighborhoods, somewhat integrated, filled with factory workers, cops, firemen, long-distance truck drivers. I never saw a man leave a house in a jacket and tie unless it was Sunday or he was in trouble. If you came knocking at our door with a suit on, you were immediately under suspicion. You wanted something. There were good neighbors filled with eccentricity and kindness and basically decent. There were creeps just like everywhere else. And you had your houses where you could tell something bad was going on. Stop quote. And he also talks about his craft in this book and, why in a songwriting he makes himself so vulnerable. And he says, most of my writing is emotionally autobiographical. I've learned you've got to pull up the things that mean something to you in order for them to mean anything to your audience. That's where the proof is. That's how they know you're not kidding. Stop quote. And an example for this, like there are just so many examples through all his songs where he takes something personal and it can mean something to you. Like at one point he writes in Darkness on the Edge of Town, the album, this song is just such great lyrics. And he writes, tonight I'll be on that hill because I can't stop. I'll be on that hill with everything I got. Lives on the line where dreams are found and lost. I'll be there on time and I'll pay the cost for wanting things that can only be found in the darkness on the edge of town. In the darkness on the edge of town. Right? Just beautiful, simple language, and everyone relates. So he is being specific in his writing, but anyone can relate from anywhere. And this point about how you write about something that is in your life, it's true only to you, but it's also universal, it's true to everything else. Time and again it comes out in Independence Day, it comes out in this song, it comes out, for example, on a song which is about a relatively non-metaphysical subject like lust, for example. He's got a great song called I'm on Fire, where the lines go, at night I wake up with the sheet soaking wet and a freight train running through the middle of my head. Only you can cool my desire. Oh, 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 I'm on fire. Oh, 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 I'm on fire. Repeated a couple of times. So that is something that's sort of, that makes his songs work so well. And then the next aspect is, of course, the language, which I'll come to. But before that, it really strikes me that, people, like I'll often get people doing my writing course saying, what do I write about? And I'm like, it's okay, look around you, and that is the stuff with which you make with which you make art, and you can turn that into great inspiring work. And that's what really Springsteen did. A lot of the stuff that he's writing about, it isn't earth shattering, mind blowing, or whatever. His sister gets pregnant and gets married, he writes about that. He can't get along with his dad, he writes about that. He writes about all of these stuff which all of us experience, and there's such magic in it.
And now let's turn to the writing. Let's put up Mr. Springsteen as a candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature.
The delightful thing about his writing, and we've actually discussed his writing before in episode 2, because we had to explain to our viewers why is the show called Everything is Everything, and it's called Everything is Everything from Springsteen's great song You're Missing. And you can go back to that episode and see what we said. But what I love about Springsteen is something that interestingly even Shakespeare brought to his work. That, we think of Shakespeare today as high literature, but Shakespeare wasn't just the pinnacle of art. He was also the box office superstar of his day, right? He was your Yash Chopra and Steven Spielberg combined. And a reason for that is that no matter what he was writing about, and a lot of it was, perhaps historical stuff or the stuff of myth, but related to the lives of everyday people. But he was writing about it in the language of the day, in the speaking rhythms of the day. Something perhaps when I talk about writing in a later episode, I'll just talk about the beautiful things he did with language and how much we can learn just by listening to other people. And Springsteen sort of does the same, where never is he using a word that you can't understand. You will not find Springsteen using a word like you did at the start of the show. You said polyglot, but the Springsteen has never used the word polyglot, and he knows what it means, but he's never used it. And even there he can falter, but he can just do beautiful things. Like in his book, I came across 2 sentences in a row. And the first one is crap, or I don't like it, apologies, Bruce. But the second one is just brilliant. It completely nails it. And he's talking about children, and he writes, "Children bring with them grace, patience, transcendence, second chances, rebirth, and a reawakening of the love that's in your heart and present in your home. They are God giving you another shot."
Yeah. Also,
Right.
the juxtaposition,
Yeah.
after that longish sentence, I'm always looking for that
Snap.
short sentence, that
Yeah.
that power of 4 words, 5 words.
And see the poetry. It's ending in a mute sound, like I say. God giving you another shot. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Great poets know how you end a line matters. So that's incredible. And in so much of his work, he's not just using really simple language which everyone understands, but he's going a level deeper than you expect. Like, I'll read out this verse from Secret Garden, which is such a great song, and you begin to wonder what it's about when you get here, where he writes, "She'll let you in her house if you come knocking late at night. She'll let you in her mouth if the words you say are right. If you pay the price, she'll let you deep inside, but there's a secret garden she hides." Right? Now, at this point, the song seems really carnal, and you think the secret garden is, the obvious thing. Even though the music is kind of very elevated, it's kind of going to a different sort of place. But then the song turns, and it's about something else entirely. And the way it ends, she'll lead you down the path. There'll be tenderness in the air. She'll let you come just far enough so you know she's really there. And she'll look at you and smile, and her eyes will say, she's got a secret garden where everything you want, where everything you need will always stay a million miles away. And what this song is really about is about how you can never truly know another person, how there are recesses within each of us that no one else can ever really grasp. And another great example of this, where a song goes from one place to another place, is from Tunnel of Love, Brilliant Disguise, which is also such a great video if you look at it, just simplicity, the camera going closer and closer. And that begins with the words, "So tell me what I see when I look in your eyes. Is that you, baby, or just a brilliant disguise?" Right? And he's talking about the masks that we all wear. And then he ends by turning it around and turning the gaze on himself, where he says, "Now look at me, baby, struggling to do everything right. And then it all falls apart when out go the lights. I'm just a lonely pilgrim. I walk this world in wealth. I want to know if it's you I don't trust, because I damn sure don't trust myself. So when you look at me, you better look hard and look twice. Is that me, baby, or just a brilliant disguise?" Right? And this is just so stunning, and you see this in all his music, of course, in You're Missing, which we've spoken about, and in pretty much every album since Darkness at the Edge of Town. I do find, much as he took so much work, 6 months to write Born to Run and all of that, some of those lyrics don't work for me in the same way. But it's a young man, he's in his 20s.
He's 24.
And it's a young man beginning to find his voice. But then when he does, by the late 20s, like, what shit were we doing in our late 20s?
We were writing really bad stuff.
And look at where this man reached. He takes that journey, he pays his dues, he plays everywhere with the Castiles and the Steel Mill and the Bruce Springsteen Band, and finally has Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, and he reaches this sort of glorious place where he reaches out to so many people with such great songwriting that sometimes we don't even realize it's great songwriting. It just feels so natural. Yeah. But yet you hear a line of one of those songs and the whole song is playing in your head because that line has got its own momentum.
Similarly, on writing, I've always been struck by Racing in the Street. It starts out as a young man and cars song. Okay, it's about the illegal activity of racing on a street, and it's cars and speed. Then halfway inside, it changes completely. I met her on a strip 3 years ago in a Camaro with this dude from LA. And then it's a psychological dive into the mind of a deeply sad person. It's absolutely amazing. You never expected, you never saw it coming. You thought it was going to be a song about cars, and it actually is a song about her. It's got this most amazing narration about a deeply sad person.
And it feels effortless, but it's 30 years of work, 40 years of work, 50 years of work. However old he is at the time he wrote that song, that's what kind of goes into it. So, for my last chapter on Bruce Springsteen, though I have more to say and I'll say it after. I mean, I could just really go on forever. But I want to talk about an aspect that you spoke about, which is the change he embraced. That's my fourth sort of theme. Because Springsteen was very determined not to be one of those musicians who's always playing cover versions of himself. Right, which is why you referred to the thrill you got from his live records, and what he would also do in his live performances is he wouldn't just go out there and sing hit after hit. He'd talk in between. I remember when I was a kid, the first time I was really entranced and blown away by Springsteen, and this I must have heard this in the 80s or the early 90s, is he was playing a live version of Growing Up, one of his early songs, and before that he spoke for what seemed like half an hour. And you like, fuck, it was just so entrancing and so brilliant, and every performance was something new. He wasn't playing covers of himself. Every night he was a different sort of Bruce Springsteen. And I remember in the late 90s and early 2000s I discovered the same kind of joy when I would hear bootleg live albums of Pearl Jam, another great band, and that all of their live albums are just so incredible. And Springsteen himself once said, songs shift their meanings when you sing them. They shift their meanings in time. They shift their meanings with who you sing them with. And he said this about Brilliant Disguise, but it kind of applies to everything where he was always working. There are so many versions of The River, for example. Niels Lofgren, who played guitar on that, said that they played for days. There's just 30, 40, 50 versions of it which exist somewhere. And there's a famous story about, and thank God it didn't work out, but when Born to Run was happening, Jean Landau had, taught him the art of, making everything crisp, editing, craft and all of that. And at one point then he got carried away and he said, yeah, edit karna hai, crisp karna hai. And he went to Backstreets and he wanted to take out the piano interlude, the piano bit at the beginning and at the end. And Landau thankfully made him see better sense. And that of course is by Roy Bittan, also known as a professor, the only person in the band who had a college degree at the time, though Max Weinberg later got it in the late 80s. And that stays in and is so beautiful. And Greil Marcus, when he reviewed the album, Greil Marcus, of course, genius music writer. I think he wrote a book on Dylan as well. And Greil Marcus, reviewing the album, wrote about that song. Backstreets begins with music so stately, so heartbreaking, that it might be the prelude to a rock and roll version of the Iliad. A rock and roll version of the Iliad, And I heard it again, after I read these words by Marcus, and I was like, fuck, this is what I've always felt, but I hadn't put it into words until Marcus kind of did. It is both intimate and epic. It's that kind of feeling. In fact, sometimes I wish that went on forever and the guy didn't start singing. And again, similarly, the song from Nebraska, which is such a great stripped down album, Atlantic City. Right? And Atlantic City, when he composed it, he wrote a note to Landau, who's producing it, that this is a song for the full band. Get the band ke saath karenge, rock and roll sound. They got the band, they did some takes, it wasn't working. And then eventually what you hear, I think, is a demo version only, just Springsteen on a guitar singing. And it's just, again, so masterful that... And if any of you, dear listeners, have stopped listening to this 15 times because you've gone to listen to a song 15 times, that's perfectly fine by us. That's what we would do too. Atlantic City is, again, such a masterpiece. And throughout his career, he's kind of doing this. He's always moving. Like Nebraska and Born in the USA were actually supposed to be one album. Then they thought, hey, should we make it a double like the river? One is acoustic, one is. Then they said, no. Nebraska's got to be on its own. It comes out without any fanfare. They don't tour for it because they've just finished a tour for the river. And then later, Born in the USA comes out, and those two were meant to be together. And that is what is beautiful, the sense of constant movement. In fact, when you said earlier, you referred to how prodigal their output was, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. And I just thought of that prodigality and I thought, what a waste. Because if there is an album where they're picking 15 songs, but they're not putting 15 out there, in today's YouTube age, they'd probably be live jamming those. And
a lot of those have started coming out.
They've started coming out, but, in the sense that I think in the modern age, they could have taken on a life of its own. But of course, we don't know where, if Springsteen would have evolved in the directions he did in the modern age.
The scarcity of the old world created a few focal points where all of us got that shared culture. So Independence Day means something to you and Independence Day means something to me. Whereas if our attention had been fragmented over many more points, our culture would not have been the same.
So I want to ask you about a couple of things. And one is about the band, the E Street Band, and we love the band so much. And at one point he made this decision that, rather than have a band which has a name like the Beatles or whatever and everything is democratic, he said that can go to hell very fast. And he also didn't want a band where he would be the main guy and there's a backup band and they don't have names. And he didn't want that either. He kind of got this in-between way, and they've stayed together all of these years, more or less. Steve Van Zandt left in the 80s, Neil Lofgren came, but then Van Zandt also came back to perform with the E Street Band in the early 80s, if I remember correctly. And he writes about all of these guys so beautifully in his autobiography. Like for Danny Federici, he had this immortal line that he had the shortest highway between his fingers and his heart. Which is such a great way to put it. And there's also this great quote. And I want to, read out the quote and then I want to ask you what you think of it. In the beginning, I knew I wanted something more than a solo act and less than a one-man, one-vote democratic band. I'd been there and it didn't fit me. Democracy in rock bands, with very few exceptions, is often a ticking time bomb. The examples are many, beginning and ending with the Beatles. Still, I wanted good musicians, friends and personalities I could bounce off. I wanted the neighborhood, the block. That's where all great rock bands came from, and there's something about that common blood or even just the image, the dream of it, that stirs emotion and camaraderie amongst your audience. You're not looking for the best players, you're looking for the right players who click into something unique. Stop quote. And I'll read that line out again. You're not looking for the best players, you're looking for the right players who click into something unique. And that to me is very interesting, because you look at all the great bands, like Ringo Starr was a terrible drummer. In fact, in a lot of the Beatles track, it's actually Paul doing the drumming. In fact, in some tracks, it's Paul playing the guitar and not George.
So I think there's a famous line by Paul McCartney saying, somebody asked him, do you believe Ringo Starr was the best drummer in the world? And Paul said he was not even the best drummer in the Beatles.
Somehow Paul seems a little bit too modest and self-effacing to say something like that, but I've heard that line, and it's kind of absolutely true. I think Mark Waugh said a similar thing about Steve not even being the best batsman in the family. You know what Mark Waugh's nickname is, by the way?
No.
It's Afghanistan. You know why?
No.
He's a forgotten war. So anyway, a completely unplanned digression into cricket there. But so what do you think about this aspect of it? Because on the one hand, you want to surround yourself with the best possible people, right? Because the looking glass self and all that. I think you've earlier said on this show, you've quoted one of your friends about how we are just a linear collection of the people that we hang out with, which is very true. But on the other hand, it is not just about hanging out with the best people. It is about hanging out with the right people.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to say 2-3 things. First is, I said a moment ago that when you look at the journey of Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or the Beatles, they're very short journeys, because it depends on all those individuals coming together and being willing to be together and sharing power and sharing that fame. An incredible success is very corrosive. It is very difficult for people to hang together after achieving incredible success. Just you watch how much you're going to hate me one day. So similarly, Simon and Garfunkel were torn apart by Bridge Over Troubled Water. It doesn't make any sense. It is their incredible moment. It's where they got everything right. But at that point, they started resenting each other. No. I did 53% of it and you did 47. So when you have that equality and sharing, it does create its own problems. So that's my one part of the idea, that you get to walk on a long journey together when you don't have those constraints of people fitting together. So that's where I get his sense of not one man, one vote, but not session musicians, of something in between. And I can see the role for that. And I'm not here to judge. Different teams, different groups, different people find different power structures. But, there is something very wrong in a bunch of people being together and agreeing that we'll all share equity equally, or more amusingly, when they say we'll take turns being CEO. So these kinds of things really don't make too much sense. The second piece in this is I entirely agree that the right team members are not the greatest exponents of their trade. Okay, so it isn't the world's best drummer and the world's best guitarist that come together to make the best band. It isn't the world's best marketing guy and the world's best technologists who come together and make a company. What you really, really need is some sense of a shared journey, some shared values, some shared purpose, some capital of the human connection to fall back on in order to overcome incompleteness of contracts and to be able to handle adversity, and worse, to handle success.
And that shared journey part is interesting. Like, one thing about Springsteen and the E Street Band is they had a long shared journey together, right, which spanned many years. And had Springsteen suddenly come out of nowhere and been an overnight hit, it could have been different. But that grounded them. Like, at one point when Greetings from Asbury Park comes out, Springsteen writes, Greetings only sold about 23,000 copies. That was a flop by record company standards, but a smash by mine. Who were all these strangers buying my music? Stop quote, right? And you've expressed a similar sentiment about this very podcast, haven't you?
We get thousands of views. Who the hell are all these people watching us?
And don't they have anything better to do? And also a little bit of trivia for you. Born to Run, Darkness at the Edge of Town, The River, all huge successes. But until 1982, well after all of these, Springsteen did not make a single paisa because he was paying back taxes. Because in 75, he got put on the cover of Time and Newsweek, and famous, after the Landau court took over, and then Born to Run came out and all of that. Just a single at the time, not the album. And he got on the cover of those magazines. And then the tax authorities came knocking, saying, hey, you've been around for so many years, you've made so much money, give the back taxes. While all this time, they were kind of going hand to mouth. Like, at one point they went to this the Steel Mill, the earlier avatar of Bruce's band. The Steel Mill went to this random club in Asbury, I think, and over there and there no club was allowing them to play. So they decided they'll roam the area, they'll find a club where nobody goes, and they found a club where nobody goes, and they went there and they told that guy, look, nobody comes here, so we'll perform here and we'll charge $1 per head for everybody walking in, and presumably then they'll buy food and drinks and whatever, and we keep that $1, and are you okay with it? So the guy said, okay, fine. So then they did that, and the first night 15 people came, and there were 5 band members. They took $3 each after playing for 10 hours or whatever the hell it was. So it was that kind of hand-to-mouth existence. You're kind of moving from place to place, you're itinerant, and suddenly these guys come and they say taxes, and Bruce is broke, the E Street Band is broke, they got a hit record, they got no money out of it. So eventually till 1982, Bruce is paying off all of that until the back taxes is gone, and they can finally keep making some money. So if Born in the USA isn't a hit, if it flops and if he never makes an album again, he's basically broke at that point. And that's just a crazy thought.
So when everybody criticizes the Indian income tax authorities, I think this is a great retort on the part of the taxmen, that taxmen everywhere can be pretty cruel.
Taxmen everywhere can be pretty cruel. So I want to end this section on Bruce before we go to our recommendations. I want to end this section on Springsteen with this beautiful quote that moved me a lot, and I want to ask you what you think of it, where he said, we honor our parents by not accepting as a final equation the most troubling characteristics of our relationship. I decided between my father and me that the sum of our troubles would not be the summation of our lives together. In analysis, you work to turn the ghosts that haunt you into ancestors who accompany you. And then he had this immortal line, I work to be an ancestor. What do you think about this? I mean, I ask because it just, in our 2 episodes ago when we spoke of, our productivity mantra, which Springsteen performed all his life, Kator Re Bhaji, all his life Springsteen katored the bhaji, as it were, if I may kind of turn kator into an English verb. He katored Re Bhaji. And in that episode, you spoke of this sense of higher purpose. And what I see in this beautiful line, I work to be an ancestor, is a sense that he is not only mining his past and his experiences for the stories that he tells, but he also has this awareness of himself as a character in the story of others and in this larger, longer story that goes on.
So to flip a line around, earlier we have said we each of us are a linear combination of our influences. Well, we each of us are adding to the linear combination of other people's experiences, and I think that's a great responsibility that we each of us, should be the best version of ourselves because we are influencing so many people. Amit, tell us your recommendations for today.
So my recommendation for today is this book right here, Bruce Springsteen, All the Songs. It's got the story of every single song, and the cover is slightly torn, which is embarrassing to me because it is in this form that I gave it to you as a gift. I ordered it from Amazon and the cover came slightly torn, but we are not going to return it because whatever, that's part of the character of the book. And it's a beautiful book. It's got stories behind all his songs, chapter, a lot of writing. I'd also, of course, recommend his autobiography, Born to Run. Beautiful writing, takes you right into the mind of the man. So these two together, I think, are just wonderful books.
But what's that other book? The Notebook, The Proof, The Third Lie. What an interesting title.
Yeah, so have you heard of Agatha Christoph?
No.
So let me tell you a little story. And that is a story of, how I picked up the book and what it means to me. I have a writing student in my writing course. I've had more than 2,200 people do the course, but one of them, and I haven't taken a permission, so I won't name her here, but she asked me once in a Q&A kind of thing that, listen, my first language isn't English. It's Hindi, and I'm having trouble with English, and what do I do? Right? And I had looked at her writing when she had, submitted writing for an exercise I gave. And what I found was that the English indeed felt like someone's second language, but there was a tremendous spark there. Suddenly there would be like a phrase which would be like, fuck, what happened here? Like this person really has the goods, So I was trying to kind of encourage her to just keep working and all of that. And as an example of learning a language from scratch and doing something with it, I pointed to Jhumpa Lahiri, who learned Italian as an adult and then wrote a book in it. And Jhumpa Lahiri has this great interview with Tyler Cowen in Conversations with Tyler. And when Jhumpa was asked about how she did this and what were her inspirations, she spoke of this woman called Agatha Christoph. Right, and Agatha Christoph is, I think, a Hungarian writer. And if I get some minor details wrong, forgive me, but the broad narrative is what it is. She was a Hungarian writer who, because of the war or whatever, at some point had to flee to France. And she was 21 years old. And she learned French from scratch. And she wrote these 3 novels, which are called the Notebook Trilogy, in French. And these are translations, but like really good translations, apparently. And to me, and these are masterpieces. Like I read the Notebook, it's a fucking example. It is like a benchmark in how you master a language and write in it. And the beautiful thing about it is the sparseness, the economy, the elegance. Every word is fulfilling a function. And it is just perfect and there's nothing else. Like some people, when they learn a language in which they don't really, which is not their native language, like a Nabokov, for example, the tendency might be you get flamboyant, you learn all these new words, these new tools, you're using them, you're throwing them everywhere. With her, is the other way around. She's stripping down the language to what is essential, and then she's stripping down life and her story to what is essential, and she's putting them together. And it is so powerful. I mean, it is all... it's like Nebraska to, go back to Bruce. So again, something that I'd recommend you, these are 3 separate novels. You get them in an omnibus edition. And therefore, and I recommended this to my writing student. And what she did was very interesting and very, very inspiring because I would not have this kind of work ethic. And it's very interesting. It sounds really weird, but I get why she was doing it. She took the book and then by hand, she started writing its sentences down. To get the rhythm of the book into her head and to understand how Agatha Christoph did what she did. Now, it might seem like a pointless exercise, khud ka likho na, why are you copying? But I get exactly what she was doing. She was getting that rhythms and, she was therefore, by that process of writing it down by hand, the same sentences that are on the page, she's looking at the language with that gehrai, that granularity that, gives it a different resonance with her. So that's my recommendation. So Ajay, what are you recommending for us?
I'm going to go to the question of father and son relationships. Okay, so there are few things in the world more wonderful and more complex than the father-son relationship, and it's interesting to everybody. So I want to recommend a few things that are centered around them. The first one we've already talked about is the song Independence Day by Bruce Springsteen. I've actually thought a lot about life in small towns in India. Okay, both you and I basically have been in the big cities all through. But there is that same drama going on all over India about people growing up in a small town, having that sense of despair, the darkness at the edge of town, the conflicts with their own families, the decisions to leave, the loss of the social network when you leave, all the difficulties, the complexities of leaving. And I have seen inside Independence Day a story about what's going on with small towns and places all over India. So I think it's a great song. It's about fathers and sons and their relationship. The second thing that I'd like to recommend is the Cat Stevens song Father and Son. Some people think it's a little cliched. Now that 20 years have gone by, I'm back to thinking it's a really great song. So, just like, don't worry that it is too famous. It's a really great song.
And he sings in the voice of both the father and the son.
Yeah, and the same person sings in the voice of both the father and the son. And the third thing I'd like to recommend is the book The Road by Cormac McCarthy. It's a father and a son trying to walk the world in a post-apocalyptic landscape. And I think it takes you deep inside what it means to be a father and a son.
And I want to end this episode with a poem this reminded me of, Self-Portrait by A.K. Ramanujan. So let me read this out. Self-Portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father.